Welcome to Psychology Ninjas. Today we're looking at biological psychology and the structure of the brain as an explanation of aggression. So we're going to treat this as if it's a theory, and therefore to get our AO1 marks we need to explain key terms associated with brain structure. We need to focus on specific parts of the brain and their impact on aggression. First of all, we talk about the limbic system, which involves the hippocampus, amygdala and hypothalamus. It's really important, again, that we link this into aggression and that this region of the brain kicks into action when we are faced with danger, triggering our fight or flight response. We then want to talk about the role of the amygdala in more depth, focusing specifically on high levels of activity in the right amygdala, which is linked to aggression. We can talk about research here in relation to cats, and that if we stimulate the amygdala, the cat acts in a way that is aggressive, and we've got some examples here. We're then going to move on and talk about the prefrontal cortex, and that this has a role in decision making and controlling our emotions. A lack of activity in the prefrontal cortex through damage or lesions might result in aggression. It's also important here to talk about the fact that the prefrontal cortex doesn't develop until we're 25 fully, and therefore if we've got younger people, they're more likely to be impulsive and therefore maybe aggressive. We can make a link to different regions of the brain based on their neurotransmitters activity. We could also talk about the role the prefrontal cortex has in controlling and dampening the amygdala, and therefore if we have damage to the PFC, we're not going to be able to regulate the amygdala and it's going to be triggered and telling us to fight when we don't need to. So that's our explanation all covered. But how do we evaluate? Well, this is a theory and therefore we're going to use SODA in order to structure our evaluation. So how does this break down? Well, within each part of SODA, we want to state, explain, elaborate and link to develop logical trains of reasoning and ensuring we're getting the highest marks. So we might talk about research support, give specific findings because we're using research for evaluative purposes, counter that with a problem with research and then explain the impact of that on our theory. Let's put this together for an 8 marker. Evaluate the role of brain structure in explaining aggression, 8 marks. Let's have a look at an 8 marker. Evaluate the role of brain structure in explaining aggression. We want to start with a detailed explanation of the limbic system and the amygdala, giving all of that wonderful terminology. From there, we want to move into our first evaluation paragraph, talking about supporting research, explaining findings from Rain et al. Study, giving specific details about the role of the right and the left amygdala. We want to counteract that with a problem with PET scans, talking about them being subjective and therefore the findings might vary. We're still going to say overall that brain structure has external reliability with lots of different pieces of research saying that brain structure is causing aggression. We're then going to oppose the role of brain structure, talking about the difference between correlation and causation, focusing specifically on the role of the right amygdala being correlated with anxiety, which wouldn't necessarily result in aggression. We're going to counter this by talking about more research that supports the role of the amygdala, focusing in on Charles Whitman and his tumour on his amygdala, which was discovered on a post-mortem. We're going to talk about extraneous variables here as our link in order to give a mini conclusion. Now, you could turn this around and change this, so talking about Rain and Charles Whitman in your supporting research and moving your discussion about problems with PET scans into your elaboration if you would like. We're then going to move on and talk about the role of the prefrontal cortex, explaining all our lovely detail about how this links specifically to aggression. We're then going to develop our different theory paragraph, talking about how brain structure is a reductionist explanation, that Charles Whitman was also a marine sniper, indicating that nurture may also be responsible. We could then talk about Phineas Gage and the damage to his prefrontal cortex making him more aggressive. Overall, we're going to be critical about the use of brain damaged patients because case studies are idiographic and lack generalisability. From here, we're going to do our final piece of explanation, talking about the role of the prefrontal cortex and neurotransmitters, the role of different neurotransmitters in different regions of the brain, particularly focusing on serotonin. We can also talk about the role of the prefrontal cortex in overriding the amygdala. We're then going to do our A in SODA, talking about the application that this has for society in terms of anti-aggressive drugs. We're linking this into talking about the impact of aggression, particularly through crime. We're going to counter that with a bit of developmental psychology, talking about the fact that the prefrontal cortex doesn't develop until 25 and therefore different responses are required. Overall, where we're talking about application, we're then saying this theory has credibility and is applicable to society. Let's look at another exam question. Explain the role of one brain structure in human behaviour, 4 marks. Let's break this exam question down. We have the command word explain, which means we need to go beyond just stating regions of the brain and give details about their role in human behaviour. Here we're probably going to focus on aggression to make our lives easier. Let's have a look at a different exam question. Zayana has noticed that as students get older, they are less aggressive in the playground. Vanessa has observed that students are often aggressive when they feel threatened or a game has escalated. She notices that this occurs regardless of age. Discuss how brain structure may explain Zayana and Vanessa's observations, 8 marks. Let's break down our exam question. Here we have the command word discuss, which is asking us to do 2 separate skills for our 8 marks. Firstly, we need to explain different brain structures associated with, in this case, aggression. We then need to apply that to Zayana and Vanessa's observations separately for our application marks. Thanks for joining us today at Psychology Ninjas. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell.